what if the dead aren't resting, but working? Everything you've been told about death, final judgment, eternal rest, oblivion, might be a carefully crafted lie. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, revealed a version of the afterlife so alive, so conscious it changes everything. In the next minutes, you'll uncover why souls don't stop evolving after death, and how that secret could free you from fear forever. We've been trained to see death as the final curtain, a full stop, a void. Some imagine peace, others fear punishment, but nearly everyone agrees on one thing: when you die, you stop. But what if that's completely wrong? Edgar Cayce didn't just suggest an alternative. He lived it through thousands of documented trance sessions. While unconscious, he accessed realms that most people dismiss as fiction, and what he saw wasn't stillness. It was motion, purpose, intelligence, souls. According to Cayce, do not sleep after death. They awaken into a different kind of awareness, one where the work continues. Cayce described a world beyond the physical, where the soul is not silenced, but amplified. No longer limited by the body, it continues its journey, learning new lessons, engaging with other consciousnesses, and perhaps most surprisingly, interacting with the living. In this post-physical reality, nothing is wasted. Life doesn't end. It shifts its rhythm. The mission isn't over. It deepens. According to Cayce's readings, souls remain engaged in the universal process of evolution. They reflect, they contribute, they guide. This vision stands in stark contrast to religious dogma or philosophical resignation. Edgar Cayce's revelations hint that our very definition of life is too small, too narrow. Death, in his view, isn't an erasure, it's an expansion. Rather than floating in stillness, disembodied minds are active, immersed in a kind of spiritual ecosystem. Cayce saw the soul as a participant in something greater, a field of learning, growth, and interaction, invisible to the human eye, but deeply real. If that's true, it raises a massive question. What are you doing with your time here? Knowing that the story doesn't stop when your pulse does. What Cayce uncovered suggests a radical rethinking of purpose. You're not here to earn a reward or dodge damnation. You're here to grow awareness that continues beyond the grave. Every experience, every relationship, every internal struggle contributes to what comes next, and those who've already crossed that invisible line. According to Cayce, they haven't left you. They're still involved, still aware, still present, just on a frequency most of us have forgotten how to hear. Edgar Cayce didn't wear robes, claim titles, or build temples. He was a quiet man from rural Kentucky who, when he closed his eyes and entered a trance, spoke with a voice that didn't seem to be his. That voice described a hidden realm, a space between lives, buzzing with energy, learning, and meaning. He called it the astral plane. According to Cayce, this realm isn't a fantasy or a dream. It's a fully conscious dimension, layered just beyond ordinary perception. And it serves a very specific purpose: education. Not the kind you find in schools with grades and rules, but a spiritual curriculum tailored to each soul's unique evolution. In this space, recently departed souls review the life they just lived, but they're not judged by anyone. There are no thrones, no fires, no halos. Instead, there is understanding, reflection, a deep, often startling awareness of how their thoughts, actions, and choices rippled out into others' lives. Edgar Cayce explained that the astral world is like a mirror, but it doesn't just reflect your appearance, it reflects your impact. What you gave, what you avoided, what you broke, what you healed, it's all there. The soul doesn't get scolded, it gets clarity, and with that clarity comes a chance to realign. The astral plane is not a holding cell. It's not a pause between lifetimes. It's a living system of review where souls recalibrate their inner compass. Each experience is revisited, not to relive pain, but to gain wisdom, not to bask in glory, but to recognize what still needs to be integrated. Some pass through this process quickly, others linger, not because they're trapped, but because they choose to stay until they're ready. Cayce emphasized that free will never disappears, not even after death. This space is layered. Souls resonate into different levels depending on the consciousness they carry. In other words, where you land in the astral isn't assigned, it's attracted. The more rigid your attachments, the denser your experience. The more open your awareness, the lighter your path becomes. Cayce painted a picture of the afterlife that is incredibly human, not distant, not detached, but rich with memory, emotion, and insight. And it's in this ethereal school that the soul remembers its real reason for ever coming to earth at all. This isn't mythology, not to Edgar Cayce. To him, the astral plane was as real as any landscape, just harder to see. It's a place where consciousness doesn't end. It organizes, it prepares, it awakens, and it's always active. What if your final reckoning isn't a trial, but a truth you witness through your own eyes? Edgar Cayce shattered the age-old image of a celestial courtroom. No angels weighing sins, no thrones, no flames, no eternal praise or punishment. In Cayce's view, what happens after death is far more intimate and infinitely more revealing. He described a review, not a judgment, a moment or a series of moments where the soul turns inward and sees its life unfold again. Not as a slideshow or story, but as experience. You don't just recall what happened, you feel it, entirely, from every angle. Here's what makes this so radical. You feel the effects of your actions not only from your own perspective, but also through the hearts of those you impacted. Did you speak words that lifted someone or shattered them? Did your silence protect or abandon? Cayce said the soul relives those moments not to be punished, but to gain a complete view of their emotional and energetic weight. And there's no one handing out grades. The only witness is you. This isn't some cruel cosmic trick. Cayce believed it was the most powerful form of learning possible. It's not shame that fuels it, it's awareness. In this space you can no longer lie to yourself. The stories you clung to fall away. What's left is clarity, the truth without distortion. For some, this realization is a gift, a moment of deep realignment. For others, it's more difficult, because the hardest thing to face is not an angry God. It's the version of yourself you've been hiding from. Cayce emphasized again and again, no one is condemning you. The universe isn't out for revenge. The process isn't about guilt or fear, it's about alignment. This review, in his words, is the soul's way of returning to its own center. It's where it sees not just what it did, but why. It's where masks dissolve, where distractions fall away, where the deeper self steps forward and says, "Now, are you ready to understand?" Edgar Cayce taught that this moment isn't a trap. It's a mirror, and the reflection it shows you might be the most honest thing you'll ever encounter, not because someone else demands it, but because your own soul wants it. Edgar Cayce was unwavering on one point. Free will doesn't die when the body does. In the world beyond, choices don't vanish, they evolve. Souls, he said, don't get shuffled around like pieces on a cosmic game board. They move according to their own will, their own readiness, their own resonance. Some remain near Earth, not because they're trapped, but because something still holds their attention. It might be a loved one, an unfinished conversation, a regret, a desire to protect. Other souls move on swiftly, carried by clarity and peace into realms far removed from this one. But in every case, they choose. Cayce rejected the idea of a one-size-fits-all afterlife. For him, there was no universal holding cell, No forced reincarnation, no divine assembly line. Instead, he described a spiritual reality that adapts to the consciousness of each being. What happens after death, he claimed, is simply the next natural step of your personal evolution. You don't go somewhere because someone sends you there. You go because it matches who you are. That means the soul continues its mission. But now without a body it can see more, feel more, understand with far fewer distortions, and with that expanded view it can choose, should I return and finish what I started? Should I remain and support from a subtler realm? Should I rise to a higher plane where my work changes form? Edgar Cayce saw all of these paths, not as privileges, but as possibilities available to any soul ready to engage with them. The spiritual realms are not ruled by authoritarian forces. They are open systems of learning, refinement, and self-directed growth. Even the souls who appear stuck, what Cayce referred to as earthbound, are not being punished. They're simply not ready to release their grip. And that's okay. Because readiness in Cayce's model can't be forced. It must arise naturally from within. This means every soul at every stage holds the wheel of its journey. You are not a passenger. You are the pilot, even after your final breath. The implications of this are enormous. If your choices carry forward beyond death, then every moment right now is part of a much larger arc. Not a test, not a trap, but a path you are constantly shaping, even when you're no longer here. According to Cayce, this freedom is not just a spiritual principle. It's the core law of existence. Consciousness chooses its own path. You didn't come here alone, and you won't leave alone either. According to Edgar Cayce, souls travel not in isolation, but in clusters. Groups of consciousness, deeply familiar with each other, weaving through lifetimes together across time, geography and identity. These are not random encounters. They are reunions, soul-level collaborations designed for shared transformation. Cayce spoke of these soul groups as spiritual ecosystems. You've likely met them already. The person who feels instantly familiar, the relationship that accelerates your growth or your pain, the stranger who shifts your life with one sentence. None of it is chance. These are orchestrated meetings, guided not by fate, but by mutual soul agreements made before this incarnation even began. In the astral realm, where the noise of physical life falls away, these bonds become undeniable. Cayce described souls finding one another again, without the masks of ego or memory. They don't need names or stories to recognize each other. They feel it, there's resonance, a knowing. And in that space, they don't just reminisce, they work. Sometimes that work is about healing old wounds left unresolved in previous lives. Other times, it's about preparing to re-enter the earth together, under new roles and new forms. Parents might return as children. Enemies might trade places. Lovers might switch roles to experience the other side of the dynamic. To Cayce, these reconnections are vital. They're the soul's way of refining through contrast, compassion, and repetition. Growth, he insisted, isn't a solo path. It's a collective unfolding. That's why in the in-between, souls don't isolate. They organize, they plan. They gather in what Cayce described as councils, not of authority, but of intention. These are small clusters of like vibrational beings, setting the stage for their next round of experiences, sometimes on Earth, sometimes elsewhere. And here's the twist Cayce made clear. You might be part of someone else's lesson. Someone else might be part of yours. That's why some souls choose to endure pain, not because they need to suffer, but because their role supports someone else's awakening. These choices are made with radical awareness, and always through free will. Reconnection is not just comfort, it's purpose. In the astral, the soul remembers that every link in the chain matters. Every relationship is a chance to evolve together or help someone else find the clarity they couldn't reach alone. So next time you meet someone and feel that unspoken pull or that resistance, remember what Cayce taught. This isn't your first encounter, and it probably won't be your last. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're gone. Edgar Cayce claimed something astonishing, that those who've crossed over are not only aware of the living, they can influence them, and they often do. But not like the ghost. Stories, not as shadowy figures in the hallway. According to Cayce, souls on the other side operate in a much more subtle and intimate way. They whisper thoughts into your mind. They shift emotions without warning. They nudge you, just enough to change your path when you're about to fall off course. He believed this influence wasn't rare. It was constant. Most people just don't notice it, because these souls don't use force or fear. They use resonance. Sometimes, what you call a gut instinct is really a message. That sudden burst of insight, that quiet voice that pulled you back from danger. Cayce said these weren't coincidences. They were signs of continued connection from souls who still care, still protect, still guide. And it doesn't stop with family. Cayce described the astral as a realm where the soul can operate with more freedom, more reach, and more clarity than it ever could in a physical body. From there, some choose to act as guardians, others as inspirers, and some as quiet healers, influencing shifts in consciousness that ripple through entire communities. But not every soul makes that leap. Cayce also warned about earthbound spirits, souls who for one reason or another remain entangled with the world they left behind, some out of fear, some out of denial, some because they've never truly accepted that they've died. These souls linger not because they're trapped, but because they haven't let go. Their energy clings to people, places, or unresolved emotions. And yet, even these souls, Cayce insisted, are not lost causes. They're simply resisting what comes next. And even in resistance, they retain their power to choose. This entire model rewrites our understanding of influence. You are not alone in your thoughts, not always the source of your most profound breakthroughs. According to Edgar Cayce, the line between this life and the next is thin, flexible, alive. The dead are not passive observers. They are participants. And when you elevate your awareness, you meet them halfway, whether you realize it or not. Most people hear the word reincarnation and think of karma chasing them down across lifetimes, a spiritual jail sentence disguised as destiny. But Edgar Cayce offered something entirely different. In his vision, reincarnation isn't about being punished. It's about being committed. To Cayce, the soul doesn't get pushed back into a body because it failed. It chooses to return because it knows there's more to learn, more to heal, more to give. Earth, in his words, is not a prison. It's a training ground, and every lifetime is another lesson in the curriculum of consciousness. You didn't land here by accident. You chose this time, this body, these conditions, and not out of obligation but out of opportunity. Cayce taught that souls select their circumstances with astonishing precision, guided by the energetic consequences of their past choices and the intentions they carry forward. That means your challenges aren't punishments, they're strategies. You might have lived as someone powerful and now need to learn empathy. You may have been harmed in one life and now return to reclaim your voice. Or maybe you're here simply to assist others on their path, to hold light when others forget where to look. This isn't karma as divine revenge. Cayce never described a cosmic scorekeeper balancing scales with anger. Instead, he saw karma as cause and effect, energy returning, not to hurt you, but to help you understand. If you caused pain, you might experience similar pain, not because you're being scolded, but so you can feel what others felt. And that feeling, not fear, is what fuels evolution. And here's the most radical part. You can opt out. Cayce was clear. No one is trapped in this cycle. If the soul has reached a point where Earth no longer serves its growth, it can move on to higher planes. Reincarnation is not a sentence, it's a voluntary contract renewed or released based on the soul's desire to evolve further. But many return, not out of necessity, but out of service. Some souls come back not to balance old patterns, but to support others. These are often the ones born into the hardest circumstances. Souls who take on burdens, not because they have to, but because they're strong enough to hold space while others wake up. Cayce described these as anchor souls, beings who've returned with full awareness of the mission, even if they forget temporarily. Eventually something shakes them, a crisis, a dream, a whisper from a place they can't name, and then it clicks. You've done this before, and you chose to come back. Reincarnation, in Cayce's world, is not an eternal loop of suffering. It's a process of mastery, a long arc of remembrance, a way for the soul to meet every version of itself until it no longer needs contrast to remember the truth. And when that moment arrives, when Earth has given you all it can, you don't disappear, you rise, not as an escape, but as a natural next step in your soul's evolution. If you think evolution ends with Earth, you're missing the most extraordinary part of the journey. Edgar Cayce didn't just explore what happens after death, he mapped what happens after rebirth is no longer necessary. In his readings, Cayce described levels of existence so refined, so luminous, that human language struggles to capture them. These are not mythical heavens. They are realms of service, stages of consciousness where souls don't strive to grow individually. They work to uplift the whole. Cayce saw spiritual development as a progression, not linear, but layered. Just as a student outgrows a classroom, the soul eventually transcends the need for physical incarnations. And when that threshold is crossed, something beautiful happens. The soul shifts from learning to leading. In these elevated planes, souls operate with full awareness of their eternal nature. There's no ego, no fear, no separation. These are beings who remember that all life is interconnected, that what touches one touches all. They move not for personal gain, but in alignment with a greater harmony that underlies everything. Cayce spoke of these souls as builders, guides, and architects of energy. They don't rule, they support. They influence the shaping of worlds, the guidance of younger souls, and the balance of collective evolution across realms, seen and unseen. Communication here is instantaneous. Thought becomes reality. Time bends. There's no need for deception or status because truth is the only currency that exists. But here's what Cayce made especially clear. These souls weren't always like this. They were once human, confused, curious, wounded, searching, just like you, and that changes everything, because if they rose, so can you, not through perfection, not through devotion to dogma, but through repeated acts of choice, courage, and clarity across lifetimes. Some of these advanced souls still work closely with Earth. Cayce described them as interdimensional allies, reaching into our reality, not to interfere, but to assist. Those whose frequency is rising, they don't push, they wait until you're ready. And when you are, the connection begins, not externally, but within. You'll recognize them by the calm that follows your chaos, the guidance that doesn't shout but resonates, the moments when you feel remembered by something beyond memory. Cayce warned not to idolize these beings. They're not divine monarchs, they're fellow travelers simply further along. And one day you will stand where they stand, not because you earned a reward, but because you remembered enough to serve. In these higher realms, evolution continues. But the goal is no longer individual growth. It's cosmic contribution, not to prove anything, not to ascend above others, but because when you fully know who you are, service is what remains. Awakening isn't peaceful, it's volatile. Edgar Cayce didn't present spiritual truth as a soothing balm. He exposed it as something disruptive, capable of shaking the very foundations of what society, religion, and education have told you to believe. Why? Because once you realize that death isn't the end, once you understand that your consciousness continues, you become much harder to control. Cayce's insights weren't just spiritually profound, they were politically dangerous. They dismantled the story that keeps most people afraid. That narrative says you get one life, one chance, one shot at salvation or eternal loss. But according to Cayce, the soul isn't limited by one existence. It's engaged in a long, deliberate evolution, one that spans countless bodies, roles, and realms. And when that truth hits you, something changes. You stop living in survival mode. You stop obeying systems designed to keep you small. You begin to see the illusion that the race for money, status, perfection was never your race to run. This is why spiritual awakening, as Cayce saw it, is not gentle. It unsettles. It's the moment when the questions you never dared to ask start demanding answers. It's when certainty dissolves and clarity begins to take its place, and not everyone around you will welcome it, because awakening threatens institutions built on fear. It challenges every hierarchy that depends on you believing you're powerless. Cayce didn't just offer hope, he handed people responsibility. That's what makes his work so controversial even now. He taught that you don't need a priest, a prophet, or a politician to access the divine. You have that access directly through your consciousness, through the choices you make, through the alignment you hold. This kind of truth doesn't just awaken individuals, it dismantles systems, and that's why it's hidden, not because it's weak, but because it's transformational. If people stopped fearing death, if they understood they were eternal, sovereign beings, the machinery of control would begin to crack. Cayce wasn't just decoding the afterlife. He was decoding why that knowledge has been kept from you. Because awakening doesn't just change what you believe, it changes what you tolerate, it changes what you chase. It changes who you are when no one is watching. And once you begin to wake up, truly wake up, there's no going back. The illusion can't hold you anymore. Death is not the enemy, it's the threshold. For Edgar Cayce, death wasn't a finish line. It was a change of address, a shift in consciousness, a return not to nothingness, but to truth. Cayce described death as the moment the soul steps out of limitation and into remembrance. What ends is not life. What ends is the illusion of separation. The world teaches us to dread this passage. We're told it's the ultimate unknown, the great silence. But Cayce's work reveals something wildly different. Death is not silence, it's a continuation, a movement into a dimension where purpose doesn't end. It amplifies. What you've built within yourself as continues. What you've ignored follows you. What you've healed becomes your strength on the other side. Cayce believed that death is less of a departure and more of a return to a broader awareness. You don't disappear. You expand, you remember. And in that remembrance, you begin to see how your time on earth fits into something much larger. An arc that stretches across lifetimes, across soul groups, across realms of experience. This realization changes everything. Suddenly, life isn't about winning or surviving. It becomes about being aware of what you're creating. Energetically, emotionally, spiritually, every decision becomes a seed. Every intention echoes, and none of it is wasted. Grief, then, takes on a new shape. Those you've lost haven't gone far. According to Cayce, they're simply living in a space just beyond the range of your senses. Still connected, still conscious, still capable of presence. And when you lose fear of death, You gain something most people never touch in their entire lives: freedom. Because without the threat of finality, you're free to focus on meaning. You're free to take risks that align with your soul, not your ego. You're free to ask better questions like, what kind of energy am I sending forward from this life? Cayce taught that how you die is less important than how you live, knowing you will die, not to pressure you, but to empower you. The moment you understand that death is a doorway and not a wall, the moment you realize your soul is still becoming something even after your last breath, that's when life becomes sacred. Not because it's fragile, but because it's eternal.